Hi, I'm Don. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is the painting of our Veronica Kickstarter. A huge thanks to Clay Cyanide for this print of our 120mm Veronica figure. I primed this figure with black lacquer primer. Now we are ready to paint with Warpaints Fanatic. First, we paint the skin. Skin painting is my fab part in painting any miniature. If you haven't seen any of my older YouTube videos, I break down the 6-color Warpaints Fanatic triad into 3 groups. The 2 darkest colors are the foundation colors, and then the middle 2 colors are the base colors, and the lighter bright colors are the highlight colors. Here we start with Oak Brown from the Brown Stride System, Rudy Brown Stride System. This is our initial foundation color. I thin my paint so that I get very nice full coverage in 2 thin coats. Warpaints Fanatic has insane coverage, but I highly recommend you thin your paint so that you get full coverage in 2 thin coats instead of just 1 heavy coat. At this point of your painting, your focus is to create volume. So make sure you leave areas of the previous color behind and you paint towards your highlights. I almost always start with the painting of any miniature painting project with the painting of the skin, especially if the miniature has lots of skin. This Veronica figure in particular, I designed this so that we get to paint different textures, different elements of the same model. I put the most effort in the painting of the skin. It's like I do more blending, more mixing of colors, more glazes definitely. And then after painting the skin, I feel that the rest of the miniature is easier to paint. The first trick to painting good skin is to use more colors or use more paints. Or if you don't have more paints, you mix more colors so that your blending is very good. So by using a lot of colors, you tend to almost automatically do good blending because you're using different tones, different hues, and you build up these colors really nicely because you mix the previous color with the current color. So by mixing all these colors and building up your layering in a very meticulous manner in a way, you don't even need to do a lot of glazes. Another way to create good blending when you're painting skin is to thin your paints a little bit more. Not glazing, just thin it a little bit more than usual. So instead of applying a specific color over the miniature when you're painting skin, if you thin the paint like this one, our base color, a little bit more, you kind of paint with translucent paint. So if you like painting the color in 2 thin coats, maybe you could thin it more so that you apply the base color or the color in 3 thin coats. So Barbarian Flesh is our initial base color. So I thin this color or this paint a little bit more so that I apply it in 3 or even 4 thin coats. Now you could see in the video that we're slowly building up towards the highlights. The Barbarian Flesh is actually lighter than how it looks in the bottom. Another trick to make sure that your skin painting has good blending is to apply the paints in via a stippling manner. You could see in the video, I'm stippling the colors, making sure that I build up the colors on the right area so that I build up the highlights, but the manner of applying the paint is via stippling. If you're not comfortable with applying paints via stippling, I highly recommend you get comfortable. Get used to stippling paints on your miniature. Stippling is the easiest way to create good blending without glazing or more complex methods. All throughout this video, you'll see me that I'll be applying paints via stippling, especially for the lighter colors, the pre-highlight colors, and the final highlight colors. The trick or the main key to stippling is to make sure you don't ruin your brush. Like, you could use an older brush if you're heavy-handed, or you could use like a dry brush if you want, if the area is bigger, or you could stipple at an angle like a 45-degree angle. The problem with that though is sometimes you create dashes instead of points or stipples. You could see that even though we did not do glazing or glazing, we did not apply glazes, we created fairly good blending with the skin painting. You could see right now that even without glazing, you could paint good skin. Now we paint the leather parts. Especially brown leather, it feels like painting skin in a way, although you want to make it look rougher. Painting leather is very similar to painting skin. In fact, I almost use the same colors. Although the main difference you'll see in the painting or the build-up of the painting and the leather here is that I left black shade area so that I get more contrast. You can see here I mix oak brown with black, a little bit of black, so that it's darker than our foundation color that we use on the painting of the skin. Also, as I paint the initial foundation color, the oak brown with black, I left black areas, black on the crevices to create more contrast. Now you could see I immediately use just oak brown to build up volume, to create volume, and to leave more areas, more shade areas, so that I create more contrast. Also notice that I'm applying the colors in a very rough manner. I'm very sketchy, and I paint random strokes, linear strokes all over the areas, making sure that it looks very rough and random, unlike with the painting of the skin. However, you could also see that I'm combining swift short strokes with stippling, because stippling works really well with the look of leather. You could also notice that I'm painting smaller and smaller areas as the colors get lighter. This is to make sure that I create higher contrast than the painting of the skin. With the skin painting, you kind of spread out the colors a little bit more, even without glazing. And with the leather, you paint the lighter colors in smaller areas so that you have very, very high contrast. Now with leather painting, you could paint more scratches or scuffing so that it looks more worn out. Or you could also make sure that it looks shinier, it looks new without too much scuffing. But if you decide to make the leather painting look like shiny leather, you will be stippling a bit more than painting scuffing or swift linear strokes. Of course, you could combine a shiny worn out leather by painting more scratches, but at the same time painting really bright colors as your highlight colors. If this miniature was smaller, I could stop at this point, but since the miniature is kind of big, we're going to push the contrast a bit more by painting more highlights. Now you could see the difference with the painting of the skin and the brown leather. The highlights are smaller, but they were applied in the same manner. I applied the highlights of the leather via stippling, similar to the skin painting. Now we're painting the red cloth. I need to add a saturated part in the painting of this miniature so that I know how much colors I would like to use on the whole miniature. Painting cloth can be tricky. If you paint too much highlights, it may look too shiny, and if it's too shiny, it will look like silk. And if you're not going for a silk cloth, it won't look right. Now painting red cloth is much more trickier, because if you apply too much highlights on red, it will look a bit more orange or a bit more pink. So we combined the tricky parts of painting cloth and painting red paint. So the red cloth painting here, I was aiming for a normal red cloth, not too shiny, not worn out, so that it creates contrast or it looks very different to the painting of the leather and of course the painting of the skin. I went for a cool reds here, meaning the highlighting is a little bit more pink than more orange. If you were to paint warm reds, your highlighting will lean towards a bit more orangey colors. When you are painting red in general, try to limit the painting of the highlight so that you don't end up with a pink red or an orange red. I mean, try to limit the use of too much orange and too much pinks when highlighting red painting. So how do you create contrast in when you're painting reds if you do not apply too much highlights? It's simple. You leave like very dark shade areas with purple. You paint that purple, or even very dark, almost black shade areas, so that you create very nice contrast with your red painting. So you have more shades, darker, really dark shades, but lesser highlights. This gives you pretty good contrast because of the darker shades. So notice with the painting of a red cloth, even though I did not push for really bright pink highlights, I left dark areas as black primer or even very dark violet, so that I have very good contrast even though I did not push the highlight colors. Similar to painting skin and painting brown leather earlier, when you're painting cloth, you have to define your base color, and you have to make sure that the base color is the most dominant part of your painting. Highlights gives you very good contrast, but you have to bear in mind that if you want more contrast and you don't want to alter the look of your colors, you can revisit your shade areas and make them darker to push the contrast. Now we paint the blue hair. Painting hair can be the most difficult part of painting any miniature, especially if the hair is long. Now there are two reasons why I find painting hair can be the most difficult part of painting a miniature. One is that the application of the paint is kind of more like you need to apply nice long strokes when you're painting hair, and you have to paint it along the surface of the model. Unlike when you're painting skin or you're painting leather or even cloth, you don't really have to like paint along the scalp too much. And with skin and leather and cloth a bit, you could like just do a bit of stippling and apply really swift short strokes, which is the easiest. But with hair painting, you have to paint along the scalp, along the strands of the hair, and then you have to paint long strokes, especially for the first few darker colors. Other than the obvious fact that you don't have, like, you need to make sure that you don't paint the crevices with colors, you have to thin your paints a little bit more than usual so that you could paint nice, really long lines with your colors. So the thinning is tricky. I can't really give you a proper ratio, but it's thinner than when you're painting base colors, but you cannot over thin it because it will be too transparent and you want really defined lines when you're painting hair. So you have to find the perfect like thinning ratio or thinning of your paint so that it's smooth and flowy or flowing, but it's not too thick, but at the same time it's not too transparent or too thin. However, once you've painted the long lines with the foundation colors or the darker colors, it gets easier because as you paint the lighter colors, your lines, your strokes can be shorter so that you establish more volume and contrast to your hair painting. As you move on to painting the lighter colors, the main trick is to paint thinner lines as the colors get lighter so that you have good volume and again good contrast. This is easy by using a smaller brush and making sure that you're not like heavy-handed. You could paint thinner lines with a smaller brush. And as you paint thinner lines with the lighter colors, you create better volume and good contrast. Now notice in the video that I'm painting really short lines but fine lines. So I switched to a finer brush. I think I'm using a 00 brush, and I'm really making sure that my highlights are really fine and very thin. So your main focus with painting hair is like making sure that you create or you paint fine, very thin lines as your colors get lighter. In that manner, you create more contrast and volume, and you don't even have to do glazes if you don't want to, if you apply these fine lines very nicely on your hair painting. Now, at the middle of painting the hair, I decided to apply magenta OSL on the right side of the area. That's why I left it unpainted, or I did not paint highlights. Now we move on to painting the OSL. I had to paint the OSL first so that I know how the secondary light source, which is the OSL, will affect the NMM. So after painting the leather and the skin, they look similar, and after painting the red cloth and the blue hair, I felt I needed a third color to make the whole miniature pop later. So I knew before painting the OSL that the armor is not gold. It will be painted steel or armor. So it's practically a neutral color. It's grayish. And the red cloth and the blue hair doesn't give balance to the painting of the whole figure. I needed a third color. So I decided to paint the magenta OSL. I fondly call OSL painting gimmick painting, because if you can pull it off, it looks really good, even if you don't paint the other parts of the miniature well. I must say though that you usually paint OSL after you've painted the whole miniature, like you finish painting the non-metallic metal and the rest of the miniature. But I decided to paint the OSL first before the non-metallic metal because I wanted to see how the OSL affects the painting of the NMM parts. Also, I knew that even if I paint the OSL really well, it won't be enough to make the painting pop. So I really needed a third color. OSL painting, like the initial colors, are easier with the airbrush because if you use the airbrush with the foundation, the bright foundation colors of the OSL, you tend to like easily blend these colors over the whole miniature. But to be honest, I find using the airbrush a little bit boring. Also, I feel that I have more control in terms of where to put the highlights, where the lighting or the effects of the OSL is bouncing on the miniature if I simply use my brush instead of using the airbrush. The airbrush is great. I use it once in a while. Like if I want to do glazing with the airbrush, that's a really good effect to blend everything together. But then again, I did not do that in the painting of this miniature because this was designed for people who doesn't want to use the airbrush or doesn't even own an airbrush. Now, the main difference of the painting of the OSL here, you could see it in the video, is that the application of the paints is it's not stippling, it's not linear strokes or scuffing. I'm practically like scribbling or painting swirly lines on the areas of the OSL because I wanted a magical look wherein there are swirly lines floating around the areas of the OSL. I had to switch to the pink striad with this pixie pink because I don't find the spellbound fuchsia from the magenta striad to be saturated enough. So I want more pop with the painting with the OSL. So I felt I had to switch to a more saturated color. Usually when I switch to a different color from a different triad system, I had to mix the previous color with the current color so that I have good gradation or blending. However, with this one, I know that we're going to blend this with glazes later. I'm using this color to establish the highlight areas and the highlight patterns later. So you could paint like thick swirly lines so that the thinner, brighter colors will look really nice and it will look glowing. Now we are using a brighter pink color. This is brighter than the previous color, but it's less saturated. I found this color a bit too bright. It's now our pre-highlight color. Our final highlight is white paint. You could see I'm stippling a bit more, especially on the weapon part, because I found the color too bright. The white paint from Warpaints Fanatic has very good coverage. Normally, I thin this down with Warpaint Stabilizer, but with this one, I just went in and painted like swirly strokes on the weapon so that we have a very intense and very bright final highlight. Now, because of the coverage of the white paint, I focus on painting swirls so that the OSL will look magical. I did not worry if it's like sticking out like a sore thumb or it's too much in terms of gradation, because now we're going to glaze it down with fluorescent paint. Similar to the regular paints of Warpaints Fanatic, the fluorescent paints have very good coverage. So you don't need to apply like 10 million layers to see the effect. Unlike fluorescent paints from other brands, except maybe cuttlefish colors, you'll see the effect of what they're doing with the fluorescent paints in a couple of thin coats. Similar to speed paints or even the Warpaints Fanatic washes, if you use the airbrush with the fluorescent paints, they will have better coverage. You could see in the video I'm also applying a little bit of fluorescent paints on some areas that will be hit by the OSL. Also, make sure you blend the edges of the white details, the white highlights, towards the pink areas of your painting. Do not worry if you over apply these fluorescent paints, because you could always like repaint the white details, the white highlights, and then reapply the fluorescent paints on some areas. Also, I did not record it on video because it was sort of an experiment. I used the blue fluorescent and mixed it with the red fluorescent paint, not the magenta fluorescent. And then the purple-ish mixture I applied on the bottom areas, the areas farther away from the hottest part of our OSL. And it turned out really nice. Like I said earlier, if you want to apply this fluorescent paints faster, you could simply use the airbrush, especially if you have pretty good airbrush control. For airbrush use, you have to thin your paints or set your air pressure higher to around 30 psi. We are almost done, and now we paint the non-metallic metal. Painting non-metallic metal is my second fab part of painting any miniature. It can be argued that the most important color or paint that you need for non-metallic metal painting is the initial color over the black primer. Now here's the problem. One of like the features of the Warpaints Fanatic, even if you have the complete set, is that the darkest colors in the triad system are not dark enough. And I think the roosters agree. So I had to mix a little bit of black paint with the deep, which is the darkest gray in the Warpaints Fanatic line. Now the darker gray allows me to paint freely, and I don't have the fear of making mistakes because it transitions better over the black primer. Now this part of the painting is crucial because you need to leave black areas so that you have more contrast later, and this will make your non-metallic metal painting more convincing. Now you see in the video we're painting with just the deep, and we're painting it in smaller areas over the darker gray earlier. The main difference of painting non-metallic metal over other elements of the miniature is that you should be focused on making sure that your highlights will look really nice later. The painting of the skin, the painting of the brown leather, and the painting of the hair, and of course the red cloth, you're focused on making sure that your base colors look nice. With non-metallic metal, you're building up your layering and like building up your painting towards the highlights so that the highlights look convincing later when you finish the non-metallic metal painting. Now the main reason why I decided not to paint non-metallic metal gold is that one of my patrons, Marco, is really good at painting gold NMM, but he struggles with steel and iron. So for some reason, people find it easier to paint NMM gold rather than paint steel NMM. The two main tricks with good non-metallic metal painting is that you paint really nice thin strokes, very linear strokes, and you do proper layering. By painting really fine lines, you'll make your non-metallic metal painting more convincing, and it will create a nice texture so that it looks like it's scratch metal, and your blending will have an illusion that it has really good blending. Similar to the painting of the blue hair, you have to create really fine lines, so you could switch with a smaller brush, a detailed brush, and make sure you create super thin and fine lines so that your non-metallic metal will look really nice later. Similar to flesh tones, gray paints tend to get really bright really fast. Again, similar to flesh tones, these bright gray paints, they will cure and darken the next day. So make sure you still use the bright gray paints to establish your highlights. Be careful not to overpaint or paint over the previous color so that you create more volume and so that your non-metallic metal looks like it's glowing. Now you notice in the painting of the highlights that I'm not doing stippling. I'm painting with very small, very short, linear strokes. As you can see in the video, key here is to make sure that you do not paint over the previous colors. We are still in the sketching stage of this non-metallic metal painting. However, you could apply this highlight color as a glaze. Although we haven't applied glazes yet, I hope it's obvious, or you could see in the video, that we created fairly good blending because we applied the paints and the lighter colors in very fine lines. So I think it's kind of obvious all throughout this video that as you paint brighter and lighter colors, you need to paint them in very fine lines and very fine strokes. Also, it's kind of important to note that you could go back to your previous gray colors to paint more like textures and scratches, as long as you don't paint over your final highlights. You may sketch and glaze, and then sketch and glaze again so that you have very good blending as you build up your layering. However, I don't paint like that because I like to do sketching a lot, and then eventually after all the sketching and layering, I'll do the glazes at the latter part of the painting process. I feel this makes my painting a little bit more efficient and a bit more linear. A quick tip in painting non-metallic metal so that you can check your contrast is to take a photo of your work, turn it into black and white, and see if you created very good contrast. It is kinda important to really check your layering or sketching if it has good contrast already, because once you apply glazes, it will further soften your contrast. But once you're happy with your sketching or layering, you may immediately proceed to applying glazes. As you can see in the video, I'm applying blue tone wash as a glaze. However, bear in mind that washes were designed and formulated to make areas darker. Now, if you want to glaze with lighter colors, or you don't want to darken those areas and introduce new colors, you may simply use regular Warpaints Fanatic. Simply thin down Warpaints Fanatic, regular Warpaints Fanatic paint, with roughly around 2 to 3 parts Warpaint stabilizer and 1 part paint. Be mindful of the colors that you're using for glazing. Glazing in general will soften your contrast, and too much highlight glazing or glazing with highlight colors will kinda flood your painting and make it less contrasting. And if you apply too much shade colors, if you glaze with too much shade colors, it will darken your overall painting. However, you see in the video right now, we only did very minimal glazing with blue tone wash, but our painting of the non-metallic metal is looking fairly good. Like I said at the start of the non-metallic metal painting, the initial foundation color is very important. I feel it's the most important part of any non-metallic metal painting. The initial foundation color should give you a good direction of where to place and build up your highlights. Now we paint the skull base. The skull base, I'm not really sure if I want to add a little bit more OSL, but we'll see. We'll start with the basic colors that I like to use when painting skulls. I eventually decided not to put OSL on the skull painting, but instead I focused on making sure that the layering or the sketching looks very rough so that it kinda separates from the look of the overall painting of the figure. I made sure that the painting of this skull base, is even rougher than the painting of the brown leather. The painting of the skull is just basic layering, but similar to the painting of the brown leather, I left black areas on the recesses and shade areas of the skull to create more contrast. You could see in the video right now that I thinned the oak brown a little bit more than usual, so that it transitions really nicely over the black primer. So you could see I decided against mixing oak brown with black to make the color darker and transition better over black primer. I simply thinned down the oak brown paint a little bit more so that, again, it transitions well over the black primer because it's more transparent. Even though I thinned down the oak brown a little bit more and I'm painting with more translucency, you could see in the video that I'm applying the paints in a very sketchy manner. The sketchy strokes will give me very good texturing as I build up the layering. Since we are painting with translucent paints and as we build up our layering, we're painting with random strokes, we build up like more texture to our painting. You could see that I'm leaving black areas, black primer in certain areas to create more contrast and to show more texture. And this will give me more volume later. Our initial foundation color is not as crucial as the painting of the foundation color of the non-metallic metal painting. However, this should give us a really nice start with the painting of this skull. So now it's a matter of just building up our layering with lighter colors and paint towards the highlights. Notice that I did not mix the previous color with the current color because I'm not aiming for good blending with the painting of the skull. I'm aiming for a very sketchy finish. I totally do not care if I create good blending. My main focus is to make sure that I paint and show where the highlights would fall. So my main two concerns as I paint this skull base is to create volume by showing where the light source is and creating more volume by painting less and less areas as I paint lighter colors. So I did not apply glazes with regular Warpaints Fanatic paints here, but eventually at the latter part of the painting, I applied multiple layers of washes. Now we are painting with leather brown. Normally, I would treat this as our base color because it's like the third color in its own brown triad. However, in this case, this is like our very light foundation color. The main reason why leather brown is not our base color is simply because it's too saturated and it's not our most dominant color after we're done with the painting of this skull base. The main focus in the painting of this leather brown is to make sure you do not paint over the previous colors so that you create more volume. It's important to note that you should paint this color mostly on the top areas because this will be your foundation color as you paint towards the highlights. Do not worry too much if you overdo the application of this color because if you overdo this color, you may simply apply more washes later to bring back the crevices and details. Also at this stage, you could introduce a different color of the same luminosity as leather brown to add more interest to your painting. However, I did not introduce another color, a new color to the painting of this skull at this stage because I want to keep the tutorial very linear and easier to understand. Once you're happy with the painting of the leather brown, you now have a very good foundation of the painting of your skull base. Now, what makes skull painting really fun is that after the painting of the foundation color, you have many options on what base color to use in the build-up of your colors. You may layer up with grays like warm grays or even cool grays, especially for the highlight colors, to come up or finish with a more desaturated look. Or you could use ochres and tans to have a warmer look to your painting. After this painting step though, I had to glue the Veronica figure on top so that I know where the shadows of the figure will fall on the skull base, and of course where to paint the highlights. Once Veronica is glued to the base, I know where to paint the highlights and to add more shades or shadows so that I create more volume to the overall look of the figure. Now, my main focus as I continue to build up painting towards the highlights is to continue to create texture and make the painting of the skull base rougher than the painting of the brown leather. The easiest way to make sure that you do not paint over the previous colors is to make sure that your painting or the application of the paint is with very random strokes. By painting very fast, sketchy, and random strokes, it's impossible to paint over the previous colors. Another trick is to shift to a smaller, finer brush or detail brush so that your painting will be finer and it's impossible again to paint over the previous colors. Lastly, if you're going for a very sketchy painting or painting style, especially for this skull base, you do not need to thin down your paints too much because you want that very sketchy look. If you thin down your paints, you'll be painting with more transparency and you'll create like a softer blending or softer look to your finish. And if you don't want that, simply do not thin down your paints too much. We are using Urban Buff, which is the lightest color of the bronze triad, for our final highlight of the painting of this skull. However, you could use Brain Matter Beige or anything lighter if you are going for a shinier finish. However, since this is just the base, I recommend you stick to just Urban Buff or something even darker so that the highlighting of the skull base won't compete with the painting of the actual Veronica figure. Oh, it's important to note that the lighter colors of the Warpaints Fanatic in general has very good coverage. More coverage than the standard colors or the base colors. So since Urban Buff has too much coverage for me, I thinned it down a little bit more than usual and applied the highlights in 2 passes. Now the idea here is to use Dragon Red as my foundation color for the flat areas of the skull base because I want these flat areas to be painted with blood effects. So blood effects is semi-transparent, so you need to paint a base or foundation color before you paint it over the black primer. I painted Dragon Red in a couple of passes to get a full coverage. Now, before applying blood effects on the base, I applied multiple layers on the whole figure, the whole miniature, to kind of smoothen my layering. Normally, I would spend hours glazing with regular Warpaints Fanatic, thinned down with Warpaint Stabilizer. As you can see in the video, I'm applying sepia wash to add more like color depth to my painting. Also, I'm using blue tone wash to kind of blend down some of my layering on the boots and of course the non-metallic metal. I decided against spending hours of glazing so that you could see that good layering just needs a bit of washes to really blend down everything and come up with good painting. Now to finish off the painting of the base, we apply a couple of really thick layers of True Blood, which is the blood effects from Warpaints Fanatic. Make sure to let dry in between layers even if you apply these effects paints thickly so that you have very nice finish to your painting. Do not force dry the blood effects with a hair dryer because you might produce cracks. Especially if you apply the blood effects really thick, you might like cure the top part of the effects paint, and then the inner parts or the underlaying layers might still be wet. Now, before I reveal, a huge thanks to all my patrons at Patreon, Hajime, Model Studio, and of course, the Army Painter for making this video possible. And of course, a huge thanks to all our backers of this Kickstarter project for making this project possible. We hope that you saw in the painting of this Veronica figure that you don't need fancy like tools, or even you don't even need an airbrush, you don't need to do wet blending. I did very minimal glazing here, but still I think we came up with fairly good painting. So even though we just did basic layering in the painting of this figure, you saw that you could create different textures, and as long as you paint towards your highlights, you create more volume and more interest to your painting. Contrast in luminosity is the most important part of painting a miniature, especially if this Veronica figure is smaller. However, you saw that making sure that you create different textures on the different elements of a miniature will create more separation and thus create contrast in texture. We hope you learned a thing or two on how to paint with the Army Painter Warpaints Fanatic in this video. That's it, Pansit. I hope you liked this video. Do like, comment, subscribe, and all that stuff. Until next video, guys. Bye!